Thank you, Eugenia, for your invitation and the organization of this colloquium. Partly, the discussion in the Brazilian left of the late 60s about how to resist the military dictatorship, the discussion that also was centered about the question whether to use armed struggle or not, were discussions between old communists. Many Brazilian communists, like Carlos Marighella or Apolonio de Carvalho, to mention two of the leaders of factions that left the PCB, the Brazilian Communist Party, thought that armed struggle is the only way or the main way to resist the military dictatorship and opt for armed struggle. Both Carlos Marighella and Apolonio de Carvalho were old communists with a long trajectory that included in their past, in their own personal past, armed struggle. Apolonio de Carvalho was part of the international brigades in Spain, where he fought, he was an aide of Luigi Longo, the Italian communist leader of the time that I am speaking about. Apolonio de Carvalho was also a hero of the French resistance. He was one of the commanders in the liberation of Toulouse, and he owned a medal of the Legion of Honor of France before he came back to Brazil to continue in his political engagement with the Communist Party. Marighella was also jailed during the late 30s and has a long trajectory being one of the main organizers of the Brazilian Communist Party in different periods. In front of them was Luis Carlos Prestes, that he's very famous, of course. He's one of the, was the Che Guevara of Latin America in the 20s and 30s, a kind of symbol of armed struggle and that symbolized heroism and sacrifice from the part of, so I am telling about these three figures to tell you that the Brazilian discussion was not a discussion between just a new left and an old left, but a discussion installed within the old left, the old communist left. The international implications of this discussion are very predictable. The Cuban leadership supported Marighella and the ALN that he created, give them active support and symbolic support because they saw the strategy that Marighella developed of urban guerrilla, a kind of development of the theory of the FOCO that the Cuban developed before. The Soviets supported Prestes, like most of the communist parties in the 60s were not interested in the development of armed struggle. And Prestes pictured his rivals as petit bourgeois adventurers, but this kind of characterization could not work when you confront the figures of Marighella and Apolonio de Carvalho, two legitimate sons of the communist movement. You cannot say that they are just petit bourgeois adventurers. Even if the Italian Communist Party could not be considered at the second half of the 60s anymore a typical pro-Soviet Communist Party, since it was developing increasingly autonomous political and ideological attitudes and a polycentric approach toward the international communist movement, it was expected that the Communist Party of the Italian Communist Party will be that had a critical attitude toward the Cuban adventures in Latin America would support Prestes. However, some documents found in the Italian and Brazilian archives show that there was an intimate and intensive relationship between some of the Brazilian guerrilla leaders and the Italian Communist Party. The practical support, logistic, propaganda, small amounts of money to the exiled Brazilian guerrillas between 1969 and 1972 was given against the explicit request of Prestes. Prestes asked the Italian communists not to give any support to the guerrilla organizations. Partially, it even contradicted the Italian communist general line of favoring in Latin America forms of struggle based on mass mobilization. The special relationship between the Italian Communist Party and the Brazilian guerrillas was originated in many old personal relationships based on shared experience of struggle. I already mentioned the linkage between Apolonio de Carvalho and Luigi Longo. I shall mention also that Apolonio was a comrade in arms with the Giuliano Paietta that was in the 70s leading the international section of the Italian Communist Party. But those were not just personal relationships. Personal relationships are important, but they are not just that. They were part of a key period for the international communist identification. I use the word that you preferred, you were uneasy with it. The Spanish Civil War and the anti-Nazi resistance during the Second World War. Those experiences created strong transnational links among the fighters that survived. And no less important, they became an important part of post-war communist identity. During the 50s and the 60s, West European and most of the Latin American communist parties did not advocate armed struggle as a political method. Instead, they were trying to integrate themselves into democratic and mostly legal politics through organized workers' struggles and parliamentary representation. When confronting a dictatorship, communists generally opt for mass civic struggle methods and broad anti-fascist alliances. However, using songs and commemorations, the communists remembered and exalted their heroism and fighting spirit in the near past. The epic of the 30s and 40s armed struggle were an important part of communist identity and were transmitted to younger generations of militants. There were also other kind of personal relationships I discovered lately in Sao Paulo archives. Some members of the Italian Communist Party were living in Brazil in the late 50s and during the 60s, and sympathized or even took part in the guerrilla organizations created by the groups that split from PCV. The reports to Italy and the contacts they provide to the exiled Brazilian revolutionaries clearly influenced the outlook of the Pichi Esteri officials, the officials of the international relationships of the Italian Communist Party. Only to mention some names, some very relatively known names. Dr. Ettore Biocca, a famous physician and anthropologist. He was an Italian communist that did important research, scientific research in Brazil, and was very close to some of the splitting communists that initiated the ALN. Later, at the 70s, Biocca took part in the second Russell Tribunal dedicated to human rights violations in Latin America, and even published a book on the state terror strategies of the Brazilian dictatorship in Italian in 74. Another person, Dario Canale. He was an Italian communist that moved to Brazil in 1966. Supposedly, he emigrated to work with his uncle that lived in Sao Paulo. The immigration is very important to understand these kind of connections. However, he became active with the Sao Paulo communist group that split from the Communist Party and created the ALN. José del Royo, then leader of the Communist Students of Sao Paulo and one of the founders of ALN, says that Canale was gifted in languages and translated a lot of materials regarding armed struggle and resistance in different parts of the world to Portuguese, contributing to the process of elaboration and of the positions of those that split with Marighella from the Communist Party. So even before the ALN was created, there was an Italian active presence translating documents from the partisan experience in Europe into Portuguese, and this was taking part in the discussions that led to the writing of the mini manual of Marighella. That will be very important lately. He was arrested and tortured in 1967 and finally expelled back to Italy. In Italy, he continued with a kind of double militancy in the Italian Communist Party and as a representative of the ALN in Italy. Another person is Urbano Stride. He was arrested in 1967 and expelled together with Canale, and he became the coordinator of solidarity with the Brazilian exiles in Italy for many years. Those cases are symptomatic for three important socio-political and cultural phenomena that I want to stress here. First, the ongoing social and political links between Italy and many countries of Latin America, particularly but not solely Brazil and Argentina, established during long decades and successive generations of immigration, exile, and cultural influences. Two, the practice of translation. The emerging ALN and PCBR, the group of Apolonio do Carvalho, activists radicalized and split from PCB while reading articles and reports regarding historical struggles in other parts of the world. Those, however, the documents, or what I found in the Sao Paulo archives was amazing. Documents produced in Portuguese were immediately translated to Spanish and to Italian and to French and distributed immediately among nets of activists and political organizations in Europe and in Latin America in the different languages. So translation is not only the translation of books or journals, but also of documents of elaboration of political strategy documents by the different groups. It means that there were readers in other languages that were in dialogue, in a fluid dialogue with those that produced these documents. I want to go further in order to maintain my time. Despite Preste's protests, the Italian Communist Party support to Brazilian guerrillas continued during 1970, 71, and the first months of 72. There were, despite what I already mentioned, the epic past of the communist movement and the personal relationships, there was something else that aroused the interest of the Italian Communist Party in the Brazilian guerrillas, particularly in the case of the ALN. They had very good and special relations with part of the Catholic Church. For Italian strategic reasons, the Italian Communist Party was extremely interested in developing alliances with the left wings of the Catholics. Looking from the Italian perspective, Brazilian rebels that obtained collaboration or sympathy from part of the Catholic Church were certainly not just extreme terrorists, as Prestes tried to depict them. However, this attitude changed promptly in April-May 1972. The Italian Communist Party decided to stop its financial support and to take a more distant attitude toward the Brazilian guerrillas and particularly toward ALN. What happened? What changed? Several things changed during the previous months. Criticism and split inside ALN. During the second half of 71, an important group of exiled ALN activists redacted and published a document entitled A Necessary Self-Critique. This document became the point of departure of what was called Leninist tendency, a dissident tendency inside ALN. They were critique of what they called the militaristic deviation of the ALN after Marighella death. They considered that armed struggle against the dictatorship should be used as complementary to other ways of struggle, and they were seeking the unification of the different groups of the Brazilian left. The Italian activists that joined ALN in the late 60s were part of this Leninist tendency. And again, their documents, the documents of this small group, were immediately translated into Italian, French, and Spanish and distributed around the world. But this was not enough in order to end the logistical support of the Italian Communist Party to the Brazilian guerrillas organization. During the first months of 1972, the glorification of the Latin American urban guerrillas became a source of a problem for the Italian Communist Party. If since the French Revolution, Latin American radicals were used to adopt European ideas and models, since the 60s and the 70s, radicalized young Europeans were adopting ideas and models created in Latin American reality. As Eurocentric Latin Americans had acted in the past, these transatlantic adoptions were generally acritical without seriously taking into account the differences of context. This adoption of simplistic models, both symbolic and practical, of revolutionary violence by young Italians interfered in the national context and created difficulties for the Italian Communist Party strategy. The contradictions between the Italian Communist glorification of Latin American guerrillas and its unwanted Italian consequences were dramatically revealed during March 1972. I want to mention briefly three events, one after the other. March, the third day of March 1972, the first Red Brigade short kidnapping action. That in this action they used the Tupamaros star as a symbol, which has a significance. Second, a week after, Giangiacomo Feltrinelli, the famous leftist editor and publisher, was dead in a confusing act, probably during a failed attack on a high voltage tower on near Milan. The attack exposed the existence of a small armed leftist organization led by Feltrinelli. The Feltrinelli was famous because he was the main editor of Latin American revolutionary literature in Italy, and very close to the Cuban revolutionary leadership. So the Latin American connection of this radicalization was considered as obvious. The third case is less remembered. On March 21, 1972, the Argentinian guerrilla organization known as the People's Revolutionary Army, ERP, kidnapped Overdan Salustro, deputy director of Italian Fiat in Argentina. Salustro had played a leading role in a previous crackdown on the Fiat Workers' Union in Argentina, and was considered very close to the military dictatorship of Argentina. On April 10, 1972, the police surrounded the ERP hideout. Salustro was killed during the shootout. An Italian Communist Party internal report revealed that Fernando Aloisio, the leader of the Italian Communist section in the Communist Party of Argentina, had tried to act as a mediator in the conflict using different contacts, but he did not succeed. However, his mediation earned the praise of the Italian Foreign Ministry and of the Italian Communist Party. Salustro's murder triggered a series of political confrontations inside the Italian left. On April 11, the Italian Communist Party led Federation of Metal Workers released a statement expressing its condolences to the family of the deceased executive. It immediately had a very harsh criticism from the part of Manifesto, a group of splitting to the left communists, particularly by Rosana Rosanda, that attacked the declaration of the Metal Workers Union, and immediately in L'Unità, Emilio Sereni attacked the terrorist methods, citing for that Engels in the 90s, writing about the anarchists. The growing acceptance of violent tactics by certain sectors of the radicalized Italian young left greatly alarmed the Italian Communist Party leadership. They were afraid that the presence and the glorification of the Brazilian guerrillas in Italy, which they have took part in it in the previous years, might give inspiration for more and more young radicalized Italians. Moreover, Salustro's death showed that in an era of Italian capitalist investments in Latin America, the two contexts might be interconnected, creating uneasy situations for a party that was planning to offer itself as a left-wing partner for the democratic Italian establishment. The Italian Communist Party denunciation of the Brazilian dictatorship, however, continued. The support for the Brazilian armed organizations was then restricted only to humanitarian issues, mainly medical treatment for few activists that were suffering the consequences of the tortures. During the second half of '72, the Italian Communist Party initiated a process of reconciliation with the Brazilian Communist Party, giving Prestes an authoritative place regarding Brazil in the Italian communist press. Prestes was not allowed to express itself in L'Unità from '69 to '72. Suddenly, he's constantly reported. However, the Italian Communist Party also supported the efforts of the Leninist tendency to convince different sectors of the guerrilla and the Brazilian Communist Party to achieve progressive reunifications. Finally, in 1975, Leninist tendency re-entered the Brazilian Communist Party. The relatively success of the Second Russell Tribunal in 1974, presided by Lelio Basso, in which activists from different political affiliations of the Brazilian opposition collaborated, contributed to create an atmosphere favorable to unity, but putting aside the issue of armed struggle. Para concluir, I want to summarize a few things. This still ongoing research, because I am still in the middle of it, challenges the way current historiography tends to clearly distinguish the limits between communists and New Left during the 60s and the 70s. In previous works, I already demonstrated how relationships between communists, activists established during the Spanish Civil War and the anti-Nazi resistance in Europe legitimated guerrilla experiences in Latin America and allowed the Brazilian guerrillas to obtain communist European support. Second, Eurocentrism characterized the relationships between Latin American lefts and European lefts until the 60s. The Latin Americans used to learn from the experience and theories of their older brothers in Europe, studying their political history, adopting models, analyzing their own reality through the lenses of European categories. Since the Cuban revolutionary victory of '59, political experiments, repertoires, concepts, and images created in Latin America started to impact in the thought and action and imagination of certain sectors of the European left that were looking for new political solutions under the impasse of the Cold War, trapped between the recovery of European capitalism under US hegemony and the disappointments of Soviet conservatism and stagnation. Whether looking for leftist renewal by new strategic proposal of alliances in order to access the structures of power and modify them from within, Fredo, Pacific way to socialism, Marxist Christian dialogue, historical compromise, Eurocommunism, or radicalizing the struggle, student revolt, new social movements, armed struggle, European leftists started to look at many Latin American experiences for their own inspiration and learning. The third thing I want to stress, the political, economic, cultural, and human relationships created many interconnections that meant both enrichment and interferences between the political dynamics. Many political agents were both Italians and Brazilians. Events in Brazil and Argentina had consequences in Italy. Italy became an important area of political action and definitions for sectors of the Brazilian left. Finally, there is still a need of an international. I'm not sure about the concept of global. I am uncomfortable with it. Maybe you will convince me, but I prefer to think it about international history of the communists and the revolutionary left during what seems to be the decisive period of the late 60s and the 70s. In this history, it seems that movements and transferences between South America, Cuba, and the Mediterranean would have a central chapter.